In this episode, we're going to one of the most important cities in North Carolina, and that's Raleigh. Now, Raleigh isn't just the final resting place of North Carolina's capital, it's also a city with a really interesting backstory. And I'm going to tell you that story right here, right now. Well, after the music, that is. Hey everybody, and welcome to the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host Curtis, and this is the weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And if you've listened to just about every episode, you're probably really tired of hearing that. But if you're new to the show, that's kind of how I start out every episode. I might change that up pretty soon. I'm a little ADD, so every once in a while I do make changes. So you may see a new intro and new music pretty soon. But anyway, whether you're coming back for the 80-something time or this is your first episode, thank you for joining me. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see I'm outside again. I got a little bit of a late start, so the sun's just coming up over the trees, so it's going to blind me for a few minutes here on my left side. But hopefully that'll pass here in just a little bit. Now, for you new folks, a lot of times I have a little bit of talking to do before we get into the content. And I don't have too much today, but I do want to say that we've had 2 new people join the Facebook group this week. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Stephanie, for joining up. We're glad to have you. Next, I want to talk about merchandise. A few of my friends have asked me if I have NC Everything podcast merchandise. I don't yet. That might be something I do in the future. But right now, I'm still trying to grow the show. Now, I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm not trying to sound greedy, but I'm still waiting to get a little bit bigger before I do any kind of like giveaways or something like that. But that is something I've thought about for a while. Next, let's talk about the beard. My birthday is coming up in a couple weeks, and I thought about shaving the beard for my birthday. My wife said it's up to me. My kid said he loves it. A random lady at Walmart said she likes the beard. I should keep it forever. So as you can see, there's a mixed crowd. And so I thought about seeing what y'all think. A friend of mine said the beard might be my identifier, and if I shave it, people might be upset with me. I'm not sure how that works. I don't think that's an issue with my guys. But just so you know, if I do shave the beard, it won't be too long before I start growing it back. It took me about 3 months to get about where I'm at right now. So if you tune into the NC Everything podcast and I have a baby face, I don't know if that's even possible anymore, but don't worry, it's not permanent. Nothing lasts forever. And the last thing before I start promoting myself, the last episode, if you listen to it, it was on Vince McMahon. And I commented on this in the last episode, but I had one of my listeners, or a couple of my listeners, request wrestlers from North Carolina. And Vince McMahon was just kind of the head of that section of the NC Everything podcast. And what I mean is there's several wrestlers from North Carolina, but since Vince McMahon was from North Carolina, I wanted to cover him first. But in the future, I'm going to put in a few more wrestlers as we go along. I didn't want to dump them all on you at one time. And I don't typically try to spoil my show. I try to hold on to some information, keep you guessing or whatever you want to call it, build suspense. But most likely the first North Carolina wrestler I'm going to cover wasn't born in North Carolina. He was actually born in France. And some of you might be able to guess who that wrestler is. I'm not going to tell you right now. But he was born in France, but he had a house in North Carolina. And so he has a place right here on the NC Everything podcast. Now, sadly, this guy isn't with us anymore, but I'm really excited and really honored to cover him on the show. All right, let me promote myself a little bit. I know you returning listeners probably get tired of hearing this. But if you're listening to this episode and you like it, you can go to the website at www.thencEverythingpodcast.com. And there, my whole catalog of episodes is right on the home screen. Or you can click episodes, and that'll take you to all the episodes and the show notes. And I just recently started recording my episodes for YouTube, so you can check that out. There'll be a link in the show notes for this episode, and there's a link on the website. I think there's 7 or 8 YouTube episodes, and I plan on doing that from now on, but the majority of my backlog is audio only. But whether you're watching or you're listening or you're doing both, if you want to help the show, the best thing you can do is subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're getting the podcast. And the reason I say that's the best thing you can do is because right now, any kind of rating or subscriptions I get, that'll put me up higher in the podcast listings, and it'll make it easier for people to find me. And if you're on Facebook, you can also join the NC Everything Podcast Facebook group. I'll have a link for that in the show notes too. And it's just a place where if we want to, we can just share our love of North Carolina. Let's see, I think that's everything. Facebook, YouTube, website. I do dabble in TikTok. I'm not a consistent producer on TikTok, but the NC Everything Podcast does have a TikTok channel. You can search that. And I'm trying to get better at that. I'm not a social media guru, I guess, but I'm trying. All right, I think that's everything, so let's go ahead and jump into the content. Like I said, we're talking about Raleigh, and like every episode, I want to give you the history, the origin story of Raleigh. And to tell you about the origin story of Raleigh, I got to tell you about the Neuse River. And the Neuse River has popped up in this show several times. It was the Tuscarora War, Bath and New Bern, and my episode on the CSS Neuse. And normally I have those episode notes with me, but I just now thought about giving those references to the Neuse River. That wasn't in my notes, so I don't have the episode notes ready, but you can search all those episodes right on the website. Anyway, the Neuse River. The Neuse River begins where the Eno River and the Flat River come together. That's called the headwaters. And from here, the Neuse River travels southeast where it eventually dumps into the Pamlico Sound. Now, the Neuse River itself gets its name from the Nuseok people, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but they lived along the Neuse River, but they were farther down east. Up around the headwaters lived the Sisquoha and the Occaneechi people. And I'm going to take a deep dive into native tribes in North Carolina eventually. I've done a little bit of research, but I'm still gathering stuff. A lot of it's hard to come by. Anyway, as time passed, English and Scotch-Irish settlers moved into the headwater area, and the Sisquoha and Occaneechi people moved on. And two of those settlers that came in, they're really the beginning of this whole thing. And that was Joel Lane and Isaac Hunter. So when Joel and Isaac settled in the area that we now know as Raleigh, there wasn't anything there. There was a trail that kind of cut across the state going there, and it was a pretty busy trail, but there wasn't really anything established there. But because it was a busy trail, after they got settled in, they decided that they would make kind of a pit stop in the area. And so they built a tavern and an eating establishment and a place to sleep. I'm not sure if it was considered a hotel back then, probably more like a bed and breakfast. But it was a nice little pit stop right there in the middle of nowhere on the trail. And as this little pit stop became more and more popular, they had to give it a name. And so they named it Wake Crossroads. Now this guy, Joel Lane, he'd go on to be a member of the General Assembly. Now about 30 years after Joel and Isaac moved into the area, Wake County is established in 1771. And since Wake Crossroads was one of the only things in this area, Wake Crossroads became the county seat. Now remember I said Joel Lane was a member of the General Assembly, so he had a lot of sway. And he's the one that actually named Wake County. He named Wake County after Margaret Wake, and she was the wife of William Tryon, who was the royal governor at that time. William Tryon is the one who built the giant house in New Bern that they started calling Tryon Palace. Now once Wake Crossroads became the county seat, they built a courthouse and a jail pretty much across the street from Joel Lane's house. And at that point, the name changed from Wake Crossroads to Wake Courthouse. And that was a common thing back then to name the town after the courthouse. One of the most famous occurrences of that is Appomattox Courthouse, where General Lee surrendered to General Grant. Now, when I was younger, I thought that the surrender took place in a courthouse, but no, the name of the town is called Appomattox Courthouse. And no, that wasn't my attempt to dabble the Civil War into this episode. It does pop up, but I have kind of a reputation of making everything about the Civil War, but that wasn't this. Man, that sun is killing me. I know I could just move. It seems like I could just move, but I got to move this table and I got to move the camera. That's a lot of work. But I'm not going to hold my hand up here the whole time either. Anyway, after the courthouse and a jail was built, they needed a church. And so Joel Lane himself helped build a church they called the Asbury Meeting House. And so now the town of Wake Courthouse is on its way. I also read somewhere that they called it Bloomsburg. I couldn't find a whole lot about Bloomsburg, but that was an alternative name for the area, apparently. So it's good that they have a town, but they still need a place for the assembly to meet. So the state legislature appoints 8 commissioners to go out and find a good place for the actual government building. And Joel Lane is a part of that too. Now, I don't think he was one of the commissioners, but since Joel Lane was one of the first in the area, he owned a crazy amount of land. And so he sells 1,000 acres of land to the state, and this area was about 12 miles from Wake Courthouse. And that purchase was made on March 30th, 1792. Now, once they picked the area for the official state capital, the name changed again from Wake Courthouse to Raleigh. And this was named after Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, most of you know who Sir Walter Raleigh is, but if you don't, he was the one that was in charge of colonizing what we call North Carolina today, but it didn't work out. His 3 attempts at colonizing North Carolina failed, and today we call that the Lost Colony. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh was eventually executed in England, but he'll live on forever right here in North Carolina. And I actually covered Sir Walter Raleigh in episode 66. So if you need more NC Everything podcast content after this episode, head on over to episode 66 and you can hear all about Sir Walter Raleigh. All right, back to the story. They buy 1,000 acres from Joel Lane, and a guy named William Christmas surveyed this whole area, and that's still in 1792. And the way this survey laid out, he set out a central area that he would call Union Square. And in Union Square, that's where the Capitol building would be, and that's where all the government stuff would take place. And from Union Square, all the roads would kind of go out from there. Think of like a bingo board. Now today, Union Square is called Capitol Square. Also in William Christmas's survey, he included 4 parks, and they were named after 3 of the governors of North Carolina and 1 attorney general. That was Governor Nash, Governor Caswell, and Governor Burke, and Attorney General Alfred Moore. And that all looked really good on paper, but in 1794, they built a brick building that was going to serve as the Capitol building, and that's when it really became official. Raleigh was the new capital. And you're not going to find that brick building today, because like a lot of my stories about North Carolina, they had fires. They had fires in 1818, 1821, and 1831. And in that 1831 fire, this brick building was destroyed. And so for the next 9 years, they pretty much met wherever was convenient for them. But in 1840, the new Capitol building was complete. And they celebrated this new Capitol building for 3 days. There were parties, there were parades. It was a huge event. Now, if you look at Raleigh today, Raleigh is humongous, and it really spans across a huge area. But back then, it was really slow to grow between 1840 and 1850. But in 1850, the railroad came through town. And that's another common theme with a lot of these early towns, is they were kind of slow to grow until the railroad came. And the main reason that is you can take a carriage wherever you want back then, but carriages are really, really slow. I live about 12 to 15 miles outside of Hillsboro, and I do know that back in the day, it was a whole day to get from where I'm living in this area by carriage up to Hillsboro. So for a round trip, you're talking about at least 2 days. And those carriages aren't going to carry but, 2, 3, 4 people. But with the railroad, you're going to get there a whole lot faster, and a whole lot more people are going to be showing up at one time. Was that a gunshot? Really? It's Sunday morning. I'm trying to record. Anyway, if you go through history or you listen to all my podcasts, there's several towns that kind of took a boom once the railroad came in. Now, the 2 railroads that came through Raleigh was the Raleigh and Gaston Railroad and the North Carolina Railroad. So in 1857, they needed more space. People were showing up, the town was growing. And so the original center of town was expanded 3 blocks on each side. Now, I'm not trying to digress after I say everything, but it was around this time, actually 1853, that the North Carolina State Fair started. And I covered it in episode 5. But just a quick overview here. It started in 1853, and the fairgrounds has moved a few times around Raleigh before it got its location that you know of today. And the State Fair has been going on the whole time since 1853, and it's only been shut down 3 times since then. Once during the Civil War, where it was used for military training grounds and a military hospital. Once during World War II, and the last time was during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're at 1861, and for you guys who know your history, you know what happened in 1861. North Carolina left the Union to join the Confederacy. And that happened on May 20th, 1861, when the state convention voted to leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Now, there was a lot of Union sympathizers around Raleigh, but regardless, there was a huge celebration for the succession. But because Raleigh is the capital of North Carolina, it had a huge target on its back. And so almost immediately, Raleigh started getting ready for war. On the current fairgrounds at that time, they established Camp Ellis. And Camp Ellis was the first military training site in North Carolina. After Camp Ellis was done, over the next few weeks, over 5,000 troops showed up in Raleigh, ready to train for war. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole Civil War, although I do plan on doing a Civil War North Carolina episode, or it might take a few episodes. That's a project I'm working on. But you know, like I said, General Lee ultimately surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 4 days after that, General Sherman, who had been marching up the coast, shows up in Raleigh with 80,000 soldiers. Now, him and his men, they raided Raleigh and they took supplies and food, but they didn't tear the city up too much. But the official occupation of Raleigh by the Federal Army started on April 13th, 1865. And General Sherman established his headquarters right there in the governor's house. Now, of course, the war ends and we enter the Reconstruction period. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep dive of what Reconstruction was, but for Raleigh, they were recovering from the war, but also we're heading up toward the 20th century. The world is changing, and everybody's got to kind of keep up. So alongside of Reconstruction, the city's really going through an overhaul too. So now I'm going to kind of go through some of the improvements that came to Raleigh. First, there's water. Every place has to have water. Now, during the 19th century, there was a whole lot of springs and wells for each of the properties around Raleigh, but that's not sustainable for a whole city. You got to have a water system. Well, in 1887, they built the Raleigh Waterworks Complex, and this was around Fayetteville Street. And with the Raleigh Waterworks Complex, 2,500,000 gallons of water was sent to a holding reservoir. And from here, all that water was sent to various water towers, and it fed water to the whole city. Now we need some good transportation. And yes, they were still using buggies and carriages back then, but this is the capital city. It's a lot of carriages and buggies moving around. And so they were improving roads and making them wider, and they were establishing roads to get to all the different businesses and shops around Raleigh. But then something really cool happened in 1891. Raleigh got an electrified streetcar. And Raleigh was one of the first cities to get the electric streetcars, and it really showed because electricity, you know, it wasn't really that efficient if you overloaded it. I mean, I guess that's still true, but this was the early stages. So the electric streetcar seemed really cool, and it really helped people get around this vast city. But the electric system in Raleigh kept failing because of the streetcar. But in 1908, the Raleigh Electric Company merged with two other electric companies, and they made the Carolina Power and Light Company. Today, that company is called Progress Energy. Well, they built a new powerhouse in 1910, and this powerhouse was reserved just for the electric streetcar. And at that point, getting around Raleigh was no problem. They said the electric streetcar went 4 times faster than the horse and carriage. Next is education, and everybody who knows anything about Raleigh or even North Carolina, there's a lot of schools here. North Carolina has always prided itself in its educational system, and some of the major schools started right here in Raleigh. In 1842, the Episcopal Church started St. Mary's College, and it's the oldest operating school in Raleigh, and it's the 3rd oldest school for girls in North Carolina. In 1858, they made the Peace Institute. And this school, which was affiliated with the Presbyterian Church, was a school for young women. In 1848, a really special school was built, and that was the North Carolina School for the Deaf and Blind. And I mentioned that school in my Ronnie Millsap episode. In 1877, they built a school for agricultural and industrial education. It was called the NC Agriculture Experiment Station, which doesn't sound like a typical school, but it does sound really interesting. Well, then in 1887, the North Carolina College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts was established. In 1917, this name was changed to North Carolina State University. Shaw University was built in 1865. Now, I know I'm back and forth on the timeline here, but Shaw University was a school for African Americans. 3 years after they built that, they built St. Augustine's College in 1867. And then in 1891, they built Meredith College. Now, all these educational institutions are right here in and around Raleigh. So you can see they weren't playing around on education. I forgot to put in a transition when I initially recorded this, but now let's talk about housing. The first area in Raleigh reserved solely for housing was called Oakwood. Now, Oakwood was northeast of downtown Raleigh, and it got its name from a nearby cemetery called Oakwood Cemetery. Now, I said this was the first area reserved just for houses, but these houses weren't just for everybody. These houses were really for the elite of Raleigh. So in Oakwood lived lawyers, educators from all the colleges, and bank employees, so, you know, that kind of sort. Now, in the southern part of Raleigh, that's where all the laborers lived, you know, regular people, I guess you could say. So we're talking about mill workers, construction workers, all the merchants, and they lived in these things called shotgun houses. So a shotgun house is one that's just really narrow. It's called a shotgun house because they say you can open the front door and back door and fire a shotgun straight through the house and never hit a wall. Just to give you an idea of what it kind of looks like. And conversely, up in that Oakwood area on the north side, they had these large Victorian style houses. So you can see there was a distinct difference between the classes of people in Raleigh. Now, every day Raleigh was growing more and more. People were coming in through the railroad. There were mills and factories going up. So at this point, Raleigh is really booming. It says just in 1903, 65 new buildings were built in Raleigh. And because of this inflow of people, housing communities started popping up all around the city. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1942. And we're going to talk about transportation again, just one more time. Because in 1942, they started construction on the Raleigh-Durham International Airport. And that seemed like the coolest new thing to come to Raleigh. But in that same year, 1942, the military took over the airport because of World War II. And in 1943, the military, they built barracks on the airport, they built up some office buildings, and they built 3 airstrips. But in 1946, they gave 1,200 acres of the airport back to Raleigh. And then in 1947, the rest of the airport was given back to Raleigh. And that's really when civilian commercial air traffic started at Raleigh-Durham Airport. Next, I want to tell you about Cameron Village. In 1947, a guy named J.W. York and R.A. Bryan bought 150 acres of land that was west of downtown Raleigh. And they had an idea for this subdivision. They wanted to build single-family housing, a bunch of retail shops, and some apartments. And they named it Cameron Village after the Cameron family that owned the land. And the Cameron family owned a plantation called Staggville. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about Staggville here in a minute. Well, Cameron Village opened at the intersection of Clark Avenue and Oberlin Road in 1949. At that time, there was 3 stores and 1 restaurant. And this was special because this was the very first shopping center opened up between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. And I don't mean just shopping. There was merchants along the way. But as far as a central shopping center, you had Atlanta, Georgia, Raleigh, North Carolina, and then Washington, D.C. And I said it opened up with 3 stores and 1 restaurant, but it grew really fast. By 1950, there were 65 stores, 566 apartments, and 100 private homes in Cameron Village. North Hills Mall opened up in the 60s, and this was the first enclosed mall in Raleigh. The first mega mall in the area opened up in the 70s, and this was Crabtree Valley Mall. Well, in 2021, Cameron Village changed its name to the Village District. That's because that plantation I told you about, Staggville, well, as you can guess, there were a lot of slaves there. But also, Staggville had more slaves than any other plantation in the state. There were over 1,000 slaves at Staggville. But anyway, Cameron Village, that caused Raleigh to grow even more. And then in 1959, they built the Research Triangle Park, which I covered in episode 76. And that was another addition to Raleigh that caused a huge boom in population. Now, as far as changes in Raleigh, 1999 was a really important year, because that's when the Carolina Hurricanes came to Raleigh. And just to give you a little bit of backstory, the Hurricanes joined the National Hockey League in 1979, and they started out as the New England Whalers. Then in 1997, they moved to Raleigh. Like I said, they kicked off in 1999, and they won the Stanley Cup during the 2005-2006 season. Now, I'm not much of a hockey guy, but I have been to one hockey game at the PNC Arena and watched the Hurricanes. A friend of mine had season tickets, and they were going out of town, so he asked me if I wanted to go watch a Hurricanes game. And like I said, I didn't know anything about hockey, but I like going to sports events, so I said yeah. And we went up there, and I had a really good time. Didn't know anything about hockey. I still don't know a whole lot about hockey, but had a really, really good time up there. But a funny story, he gave us another opportunity to go see the Hurricanes, me and my friend. So we head up to the PNC Arena, going to watch my second ever hockey game. And not being funny, but we parked, and I made a comment about how there were no other white people in the parking lot. Now, everybody's kind of flowing toward the building, but me and my friend were the only white people in the parking lot. And I kind of pointed that out, and I said, something's kind of weird here. Anyway, we get up in line, and again, the line is long. We're the only white people in line. Well, you got to go through these metal detectors to get into the PNC Arena. Well, she goes through first, and I see her talking to the security guard. Well, then I go through. Well, she turns around and says, they're not having hockey tonight. And I said, oh, they're not? What are they doing? She said, Cat Williams is here tonight. And if you don't know, Cat Williams is a comedian. Well, at that point, I forgot all about hockey. I wanted to see Cat Williams. He's, hilarious. But those tickets were out of our price range, which was $0. And so we didn't see hockey and we didn't see Cat Williams, but it was kind of a funny story. All right, I think I'm going to finish up with a few of my favorite places in Raleigh. One of them is the Museum of Natural Science. I go there as often as I can. Well, in 1879, North Carolina started collecting agricultural and geological artifacts to try to put together some sort of museum. And so they traveled around the state collecting all this stuff. And it was this stuff that they started collecting in 1879 that would ultimately become the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science. Now, right beside the Museum of Natural Science is the Museum of History. And the backstory on that, you got a guy named Samuel Acort Ashe. He works for the Raleigh News and Observer. He's a publisher. He goes to Boston in the 1880s. And when he got to Boston, he was just amazed at all the history around Boston, and not just the history, but how they were preserving it and collecting it. And he wanted to recreate that in North Carolina. And so he started a campaign to kind of get this done, and he sent out collectors around the state to get artifacts and see what they could find. And it was actually this search party that started the search party for the Natural Science Museum. So they were collecting these artifacts for the history too. Eventually they all found enough to get something started. And so on December 5th, 1902, they opened their collection to the public and called it the Hall of History. In 1939, the museum was moved to the corner of Edenton and Salisbury Street. But the collection just kept on growing and growing. So in 1968, they had to move again. And so they moved to the Archives and History State Library building at 109 East Jones Street. And like I said, the History and the Science Museum are right beside each other. If you get a chance to go up and see these places, I wouldn't pass it up. And at the time of this recording, admission to both the Science and History Museum is free. Now we got William B. Umstead State Park. This is located along Crabtree Creek. And so, real quick, the backstory on this, once this area got settled along Crabtree Creek, they set up mills. And they also started farming along the banks. Well, back then, there were really poor farming practices, and eventually the ground was depleted of nutrients. So it was left kind of desolate. Within in 1934, the state and federal agencies buy 5,000 acres of this area along Crabtree Creek. And their whole intention is to build a recreation area. So they call in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, which I mentioned in one of my episodes. I can't remember which one. And they started with 4 campgrounds, and they also had day use areas and picnic facilities. And then the park opened up in 1937. Now, it was owned by the federal government and the state, but eventually the state buys out the government's part for $1 per acre. Well, then in the 1950s, the park was split. 1,000 acres was reserved for blacks only. And this segregated area was called Reedy Creek State Park. Oh, and one thing I missed. When this park was first established, the main part of it, it was called the Crabtree Creek Recreational Demonstration Area, which is a mouthful. But it didn't keep that crazy name for very long. Eventually, it was named after Governor William Bradley Umstead. But eventually, the parks were desegregated, and they were kind of put together all under the William B. Umstead State Park name. And even though they were desegregated, today, the road that went into the Reedy Creek area doesn't connect with the road that went into the William B. Umstead area. And that's really the only evidence that the park was ever segregated in the first place, is just the 2 roads are still separate. And the last thing I want to tell you about before we wrap up is the Raleigh Farmers Market. It's another one of my favorite places to go to, and I say I go as much as I can, but we get up there probably 4 or 5 times a year. In fact, with this warm weather, today would be a great day to go up to the farmers market. So before World War II, there was a lot of, I guess you could say, farmers markets around, but really just individuals were kind of selling their produce on roadside stands and on street corners. But in 1955, they designated a 17-acre area for an actual farmers market, where all the different farmers could come together and collectively sell their produce. Well, by the 1970s, the farmers market was about to bust at the seams. There was a lot of people coming up here to sell, and so they needed some more space. Well, the good news is the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, they owned a lot of land all around, and they owned a dairy farm near the Dorothea Dix Hospital. And so this land was bought for the new farmers market, and it's been the farmers market location ever since. If you're in and around Raleigh and you've never been to a farmers market, on one of these pretty days like this, it would be a great day to go up there. And there's a lot of times where we ride up there and we really don't get much. We just enjoy walking around the farmers market. I say we don't get much, but I always end up getting peaches or grapes. My kids, they can't not get something every time they go up there. But my point is, it was just a great atmosphere to walk around and enjoy part of your day. And that's all I have for Raleigh. I'm actually really happy ending on the farmers market. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And I know there's got to be stuff in Raleigh's history that I missed. And there's probably a lot of stuff that I could have dug a little deeper on. But either way, I hope you enjoyed the final resting place of North Carolina's capital. And the reason I say the final resting place, when we were the Carolina colony, the capital was at Charleston at one point, and then it was at Wilmington and New Bern and Bath. And over the history, really, the government, the North Carolina government, kind of met wherever was convenient for them or wherever the governor happened to be living at the time. And so the capital has moved all over. The government has actually even met in Hillsborough. But I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did like the show and you want to help, don't forget you can subscribe, rate. And if you want more NC Everything podcast content, you can join the Facebook group by searching the NC Everything podcast on Facebook. But there's also going to be links for all that in the show notes. And you can also follow me on TikTok, Instagram. I think I have a Twitter. I don't do a whole lot of tweeting. Most of my social media activity is on Facebook. But anyway, don't forget to check out the website at www.thencEverythingpodcast.com. And you can check out, like I said, the backlog of episodes. And the website has a little bit more than that. I have a little write-up about myself and the show. But the most important thing on the website is the contact button. It's my favorite button on the website. If you have an idea for a show, or you just want to reach out and say hello, or just send me a comment, you can do that by hitting the contact button on the website. But I'll also have a link for that in the show notes. And my favorite thing is when I open up my email and somebody has wrote to me about the show. Maybe that's a silly thing to get excited about, but it does make me very excited. And that's it. I mentioned maybe going to the farmer's market today because it's a pretty day, and the more I think about it, the more that idea sounds really good. So I guess I'll go in here and try to talk my wife into going up to Raleigh. But as for you guys, you have a good week, and I'll talk to you next time.